Here we go.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. As most of you know, my name is Carol Stern, and I'm a librarian here at the Glen Cove Public Library. Before we begin, I just want to tell you the next month's author is Amanda Peters, who wrote The Berry Pickers. She'll be here with via Zoom on Tuesday, September 10th at 2 p.m. That's Tuesday, September 10th at 2 p.m. So hi, Roxana Robinson. Welcome, and thank you for coming.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So Roxana is the award-winning author of 7 novels, is that correct?
That's correct.
And 3 short story collections. Her career has spanned over several decades. Her works often examine themes of personal and family relationships, as well as the complexities of contemporary life. Her fiction has appeared in the New Yorker, Atlantic, Harper's, and other publications. She lives in New York City and Connecticut, and she spends as much time in Maine as possible. Is that correct?
Correct.
I read it online. And she teaches an MFA program at Hunter College. So if you have any questions, please post them in the chat, and we'll try to get to all the questions at the end of the discussion. We'll try to, as I said, we'll get to as many as we can. And we'll mute everybody during this discussion. So I love a good read that challenges me to reflect deeply on the characters and plots and examine how various elements contribute to the narrative's conclusion. Leaving did this for me. So before we even get into the book, can you tell us a little about yourself? How did you begin your career as a writer? How did you get into teaching and writing at the same time? And when do you have time to write when you're teaching?
I always wanted to be a writer. I started writing when everybody else does at the age of 6 in first grade. It's just writers don't stop. We just keep going. And I worked in the art world before I was able to give up everything else and just write. So the art world figures in a lot of my work because it's the world outside writing that I know the best. What were the other questions? Oh, I got into teaching because I was asked to teach a lit class. Actually, it's a lit course, not exactly a writing course, in the MFA program. And so that's a great pleasure to me. I teach the great books. I teach Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina, To the Lighthouse, just wonderful books that are a great pleasure to read and to discuss. And I only teach one semester and one course, so the program makes it very easy to be a writer and a teacher at the same time.
So what was the inspiration for beginning this book, Leaving? What inspired you to write this? Well,
writers draw on the world around them, and I am always watching and curious about the world around me and what people are doing in it and how they're responding to everything: politics, climate change, anything, family interactions. So this book was a long time in starting, but I started to notice a couple of incidents really sort of made me focus, but they both took place years ago, but I didn't really think about them together until I started this book. But so this was about, I don't know, 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. I was at a family party, an engagement party in my husband's family. And we were at a club in Boston, and I was talking to a woman I didn't know. She was much older than I was. And she had white hair with little permed curls close to the head. She was wearing pearls and a nice silk dress. And she said, I was standing in this room right here when I looked across the room and I saw Peter for the first time, and I knew I was going to marry him. I knew I was going to fall in love and marry him. And I said, oh, and you did? And she said, and I did. And I said, and when was that? And she said, 3 years ago. And I thought, I didn't know about stories like that. I just thought that was something that happened when you were 20, not when you were 75. So that was interesting to me. And then I was at a fundraiser in Maine where we used to have a house and we used to go every summer. And so I was sitting next, and you bought a ticket to the fundraiser and you went to somebody's house. You didn't know who it was. And so I was at somebody's house that I didn't know. I was sitting next to the host and I was asking him questions about Maine and how long he'd been there and what about the house and everything, because I'm a writer, because that's what I do, is ask questions. And as he was talking, and he was also much older than I was, he was in his 70s or 80s. And as he was talking, it became clear to me that the woman who was the hostess was not his wife. And I said, "Oh, so you two are," and he said, "We're living in sin." And it was such a great comment. And it was, as I say, it was about 20 years ago, because that phrase was really used in the 60s and 70s to kind of shock the bourgeoisie. And it was on the big tidal surge of sexual liberation, and you were supposed to do whatever you wanted. But in terms of shocking the bourgeoisie, he was the bourgeoisie. This is a really well-educated, nice man with a great, huge house in Maine. And I can't think of anybody who's more essentially part of the bourgeoisie. So it was funny that he understood that it was funny what he was saying. And he said, we both have children from our other marriages. I think he was a widower. And he said, our finances are set, and we're not going to get married. And of course, at this point, nobody's going to criticize you for that. It's, there's no social, you're not going to be made into a social outcast. So that was interesting to me too, that there was these stories in the second half of life that I had not been paying attention to. I had not been focusing on. And the more I thought about it, the more interested I was in the fact that in the second half of life, when you have a relationship, when you start a relationship, the circumstances are so different from those that apply when you're in your 20s. When you're in your 20s and you meet somebody and you fall in love, the two of you can go and live in China if you want. That you have nothing stopping you. You have no obstacle. You have no obligations. But if you meet when you're 60, you have a whole world that you've built, and you may have a house that you've lived in and raised your children in. You may have been there for 30 years. You have a job, you have colleagues, you have this nest that you have created that surrounds you, and that's part of who you are. So if you fall in love with someone who lives far away or has circumstances that don't allow yourself to carry on the life that you have, it becomes much more complex, much more interesting. And I mean, in different ways than the love story that happens between people in their 20s. And those stories, this love stories of people in their 20s, we have read many, many times. We've read Romeo and Juliet. We've read John Cheever in the Midlife Crisis, but we haven't read the stories of people who are in their 60s or 70s and especially reconnecting with somebody. Somebody asked me why I had Sarah and Warren be people who'd known each other before. And it's really because that is a jump start. It allows you to enter into the relationship at a different point from the point of entry. You already know the person. You already have reasons for liking them and trusting them and knowing them. So and it's not uncommon. Since this book came out, I've gotten lots of messages from people who say this happened to me, or I'm seeing the person I knew when I was in high school, or there is a kind of draw to people that you've known before, that you've been connected to. So I wanted to write about excuse me, this is a call that I have to take. Hello? 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 Yes. Yes. Hello? 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 Can you hear me? Oh, yes. I'm on a Zoom call. Okay, I'll call you back. Okay, thank you so much. I apologize. This is a medical situation, and I thought that was an emergency call, but it's not.
Oh.
So, So anyway, those were the reasons that I thought it was very interesting to start to learn about what happens to people romantically and psychically and psychologically in the second half of life, and how interesting that story would be, how much more complicated than I had thought it was.
I find it very interesting too. Like I loved, you just you talk about a single woman in her 60s. It's just such a refreshing thing because you're right. When you think everything happens in their 20s, and there are a lot of people in their 60s and 70s who are now single. And they have lives and they're not invisible. They are actually visible people.
They're visible and they're thriving. One woman who interviewed me said, "I love the fact that Sarah has such a great life, that she has this beautiful house that she loves, and she has a job that she loves, and she has the dog." She said she's aspirational, which is not what I had thought of. But yeah, I think, why not say women can have wonderful lives alone and they're very full and rich. And so why not talk about that?
Yeah, it was great. I loved it. So can you talk about your writing process a little? How long did it take you to write this book? You said in at the beginning that it took you a while. What is a while?
Um, it's hard to say. I think this book actually took less time than most of my other books because I didn't have to do any research. The preceding 3 or 4 books required that I learn about worlds that I didn't know about at all. So they took me a long time to do research. I think this took me 2 or 3 years to write. I don't know exactly. Yeah, 2 or 3 years. It takes me. I'm a slow writer because every sentence, every paragraph gets rewritten and reconsidered. So it's not that I don't write a first draft and then pull it to pieces and create a second draft out of it. I only write one draft, but I work over and over every chapter. So I'm slow.
Do you outline? Do you outline it? Do you know the beginning and the ending? Did you know that it was going to end that way, or do you go along? As you go along, you do it.
Usually I don't know the ending. This time I did know the ending, but usually I don't. But I don't write an outline.
And at what point do you know if it's going to be like a fictional novel or a short story? Like at what point, when do you, that's at the beginning. So when you knew the ending, you knew the whole story already? You knew what you were going to.
I knew the shape of it. I didn't, short stories, I don't write them so much anymore. I really focus on novels. But with a short story, I start with the ending. I start with a moment that I find very powerful and compelling to me. And my job as a writer is to make that ending be as compelling for you as it was to me. And so I write a story towards that ending. But with a novel, except for this one, and actually the one before, which is really a biographical novel. So I knew the ending of that. But usually I don't know the ending. I start with a problem, something that I find confusing or disturbing. And a cast of characters kind of emerges. I get to know the characters, and then they basically create the narrative around a subject that I find disturbing. Like with Sparta, it was the question of being at war in Iraq. Should we be there? What was going to happen to people who were sent there? What did that do to their lives when they came home? And what did it do to the families who sent them?
So at the beginning, when you were first talking, you talked about that you like art. So you talked, when Sarah and Warren met in college and then they met later in the opera. Like, how did you include the opera and why did you include the opera? Is that part of the art world that you love?
It's a really good question. It's not part of the art world, and the opera is not my world. It's my husband's world, and he introduced me to the opera. He started taking me to the opera, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago. And he is a real scholar and has studied music and has taken lots of courses. And he knows much more about opera than I do, and he knows about it on a very scholarly level. I don't know anything scholarly about it, but I love the opera, and I love the way music amplifies emotions and amplifies the narrative. And I just wanted to celebrate that aspect of cultural life, the fact that opera is so splendid, and and the Opera House in New York is so kind of glorious, and that just gives you another way of being in the world, is learning this kind of glorious emotional tidal wave that sweeps through you when you go to the opera.
So are those that you picked the opera Tosca? Is that a favorite of yours, or like
It
how
is a
did,
favorite. And again, when I wrote that scene, I did not know what the ending was going to be. I did not think, okay, this is how it's going to be. I wrote it because I had gone to that particular performance of Tosca. And it was so striking to me. It's so powerful and so beautiful. And a friend emailed me and she said, which Tosca was it? She really knows about opera. So I looked it up and told her when it was. And she said, oh, I know that singer and she's fabulous. And anyway, so she was confirming my sense that it was an extraordinary moment. But as I say, writers draw on the world they see around them. And so if there's something that's striking to me, whether it's beautiful or painful or confusing, I often just draw that into the book as part of the narrative.
so part of the narrative is their love story that they had. So they found that they discovered each other again, and then they fell in love, and then it was a love story, and then it ended. Can you talk about that? How you structured that in the novel and how you did that and why you did that?
Um, it's not something, it's organic. I don't think of a structure. I don't have, as I say, I don't do an outline. It's all, I write each scene and then the next scene follows it. So it's not something that I can explain. It's the character, as I say, the characters create the narrative. So if one character creates a blow up, then the next scene is following. It's there are repercussions to that blow up in the next scene, but it's not. It's something that the narrative itself creates.
So the characters. So you never stop being a parent in life.
Yes,
Your kids,
couldn't do
if your kid is 40 years old or 4 years old, you never stop being
Zoom
a
on
parent.
the computer.
I just want to mute that person. Um, uh, I was struck by how important children's lives really are in adults' lives, no matter the age. So Sarah and her daughter Meg and Warren's daughter Kat, they expressed attitudes towards the affair very differently. Can you talk about that a little? Kat said that he's choosing you are leaving your life with us. That's what she was saying, and you'll never have a relationship with them. Can you talk about that a little?
Well, Kat and Megan have different situations. For Meg, her parents' divorce took place years ago, so she's no longer feeling involved in that. She doesn't have a position to take, and she wants her mother to be happy. But for Kat, who's an only child, she feels responsible for her parents' marriage, and she feels very protective of her mother. So she really can't tolerate the idea that her father is going to wound her mother in this way.
So you talk about boundary issues in relationships. Is it an honor to do what she did, or is it boundary for the morality of the whole thing? What binds us to our marital oaths and what,
I think Warren is more concerned with honor than Kat is. Kat is more concerned with the emotional consequences of what he's doing. I mean, part of the issue is that she's smarter than her mother is, and she knows that her father is smarter than her mother is. And that's something that is unbelievably painful to her. And she wants to protect her mother from she wants to protect her mother for being blamed for something that she can't help. So Kat sees herself as a guardian of her mother's emotional life. and she can't give that up. Nothing persuades her to give that up. For Warren, it's more a sense of honor, and he feels he is not somebody, he can't live with himself if he breaks a vow twice. He just can't be that person. And he also knows that if he did break it a second time, he would never see Kat again or her children. So he doesn't feel he has a choice.
Right. It's a hard choice. Like, what do you owe yourself for happiness? And does she really want to stay in a marriage that she knows he doesn't want to be there? It's a dilemma. I think.
I think Janet thinks that he does want to stay. I mean, I think she's persuaded herself of that. So it's not so much of a dilemma for her. She believes that he loved her all along, and she believes that he can just come back to her. And that's the way she manages. You know, we all have some kind of corner in ourselves that believe something that isn't necessarily true, but we do it for sort of survival. And that's her means of survival, is believing that Warren loves her.
So do you personally think it's better to take the risk and change the relationship, or play it safe and stay in a relationship? Or am I not allowed to ask that?
You mean, what would I do if I were
Yeah,
Warren? Oh boy. I mean, of course I want Warren to stay with Sarah. How could I not?
right.
But I respect him. It's a terrible choice. And, you know, one of the issues that interested me is that we live in an age of irony. And so honor is not something that we discuss. It's not part of the public discourse. Nobody talks about honor. We talk about irony, and we're quite cynical. So it's one of the reasons that opera interests me, because opera is a romantic form. And so it has a hard time surviving in contemporary times, which is an age of irony. So Warren considers honor to be essential to his sense of himself. And we all have codes of honor, whether we label them that way or not. We all know that there are things privately that we would never do, that doesn't comport with the person that we want to be, that the person that we think we are, whatever it is. You know where the red line is. You would never step over that. So for Warren, it's something incredibly dramatic. And he not only feels he cannot break his promise twice, he also feels that the life he's leading is intolerable.
Right. But before they met, you described as that they were both sort of happy in their lives. And
I
then
don't really say that. I
you
don't really,
didn't,
I don't say it about Warren. I say it about Sarah.
but he tolerated his life. I
Yeah,
mean,
but that's different from being happy.
okay. But as I was reading it, I felt like he wasn't discontent. And then when he met her, it was like, this is over.
He was living like Janet. He was living a life that allowed, he was believing that things were fine. He loved Kat and he loved Janet in a way. And then when he met Sarah again, he was reminded of the other kind of life. And then his life became unbearable.
So can you talk about the ending a little? Like, what can you talk about the conclusion? Or
So do we know how many people have, I don't want to spoil it. I don't want
I'm
to do it.
assuming people read the book.
Okay. Okay, if you if you haven't read the book, just turn me off, just mute me. Um, well, I mean, I've already more or less said what how it happened, because he really took this notion of honor very seriously. We know that was what he was like when he was growing up, because we learn about the fact that he left school because out of protest, because he thought another student was treated dishonorably. So we know he's ready to give things up for his sense of honor. And he leads a life for a while of kind of hoping that he will be able to tolerate things. And then he finds he can't lead that life any longer. And he really has a code that he cannot break for himself. So it's a 19th century story. I mean, there are lots of stories like this in the 19th century, people who went to the gallows or fought a duel or risked their lives in some way to protect their honor. We don't, as I say, it's not part of public conversation now, but everybody still has a code of honor that they live up to internally. It's just not as dramatic for most people.
No, this was dramatic. And I didn't see it coming. You know, I didn't expect it. It was very sad, actually.
Some people say I knew from the last chapter, or I could see it coming, or it was inevitable. And some people say it shouldn't have happened. I didn't see it coming. So it just depends on how you read it.
That's interesting. So you talked a lot about sex in older adults also. That's also another topic that really isn't written about or talked about. Was that a challenge to write, or is it
Well,
difficult to write that?
a number of people have asked me about that. I mean, what I wanted to do, also sex, like relationships between 20-year-olds has been written about a zillion times, but I didn't want to write anything that was salacious or kind of titillating, but I wanted to write about the real emotional challenge of sex, especially when you're not 50 anymore. But the feeling of vulnerability and fear and anxiety, and then the possibilities of trust and comfort and love that are part of a physical bonding. So I wanted to write about the emotional part of it really more than the physical part.
And you did that well, yes. So do any of the characters resemble anyone in your life, or is there anybody that it's a little autobiographical?
Yeah, that dog, that was my last dog.
And what about the Warren, Sarah? You just nothing. You don't know anybody like that. Can you talk about the title? Was that your original title? Was it always leaving?
Actually, an earlier choice was The Other Life, which I was kind of a fan of, but people told me it sounded spiritual, so it was people thinking that they were listening to voices from beyond. So we chose Leaving, which I like.
And the cover with that, do you have any say in the cover or nothing?
I mean, they proposed it to me, but I thought it was beautiful. So that was it. It's certainly not my design. It was Norton who made that beautiful
So I
design.
thought the title was really well done, because there was so many interpretations of leaving in the book. It's not just one interpretation at the end. There were so many different ways you could interpret the title.
Yeah, it works very well.
What are you working on next? Are you writing another book, or?
I'm writing another novel, but I never talk about them while I write them.
When will that be published? Or you're not allowed to say that either?
So
No.
I haven't finished it yet, so I don't know.
Is there anything I didn't say in this that you can add to about the story?
Let's see. I think you covered a lot. You raised some really interesting questions. I don't think so.
There was one question in the chat. If anyone else has any questions, why did you end the book with the suicide? You said that, and did they model the daughter after anyone? And
No.
no. Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask? Oh, okay. Even when Warren returned to his marriage, his daughter didn't treat him well. Then she went on to live her own life, and he was alone. He was a man of honor.
Yeah, and the question about Kat is, I mean, she loses our sympathy because she doesn't allow Warren back into her embrace. But she gets stuck. She gets sort of stuck in that attitude towards him, which is just holding him at a distance. She feels as though she can't really trust him. And then she is involved in another marriage, her own world. She then has a husband and she has children, so she's never going to be the close companion that she was originally. So it's what she does is partly conscious and partly unconscious. It's partly the normal shifts that take place in life. Once your children marry and have their own children, they're no longer the close companions to you that they used to be. So that's part of the pain that Warren feels. And the other part is that Kat, on some level that she can't even control, can never trust him again.
Yeah, that's sad.
Yeah, it is sad. It is sad.
Do you consciously write a book like it was written like an opera with passion and tragedy?
I have never written a book thinking about an opera before, but I do write about high stakes. I am drawn to situations in which the characters really have a lot to risk, where people are taken to the highest point of engagement. Yeah, that's what interests me. I'm not interested in a little easy tale that is full of charm. I really am interested in things that are more demanding.
So if Warren's relationship with Kat had improved, would it have taken his life or made peace with his life to have his daughter back?
That's not what happened. I can't tell you about
Also,
anything that didn't happen in the book.
so another question is, does Warren end his life because he feels he has broken his code of honor, or because he cannot live with the consequences of staying true to his code of honor?
But he doesn't do it because he broke his code of honor, because he is keeping his word. But both things are true. He's keeping his word, and he can't tolerate the life that assigns to him.
So another question was, at some point, Kat broke into Warren's phone and it looked like he was finally going to stand up to her. Did you do that purposely to throw off the reader?
No, nothing is I don't think, as I say, I don't have an outline. These scenes develop organically. Warren is furious that she broke into his phone. He doesn't think that's an honorable thing to do. It isn't. She feels like, I'm sorry, that's my landline line ringing, if you can hear it. She feels that, like anybody who's dealing with adultery, she feels it's all right to break codes, because, I mean, any story you hear about when somebody says, I picked up my husband's cell phone and I looked at his texts and I saw he's texting his coworker. And so anybody who feels that somebody is cheating on them feels that they have the right to cheat, to find out about it. So what Kat does is not honorable, but she feels she has to find out if her father is being honorable. And because Warren isn't quite honorable at that point, he was still texting Sarah, although he had promised that he wasn't having a relationship, and he wasn't, but he knew at some level he was still maintaining a relationship, which he shouldn't. So he couldn't really challenge Kat for what she had done, because he wasn't quite being honorable himself.
So do you see a difference between morality versus honor?
Oh, good question. Um,
Personal consciousness versus with morality versus society values.
I'm
You
sorry, I'm sorry, I have to get that phone.
Who's talking about I'm thinking, I say sorry.
I'm so sorry. As I say, there's a medical issue going on, and I just,
I hope everything's okay.
yeah, they hung up before I could get them. Okay, morality and honor. That is a really good question. I think there is a difference, don't you? I think honor is a kind of a more elevated notion, a more elevated idea that can be kind of an idea instead of something that you live by. I mean, something that's more an idea than a practical mode. So it's a really good question. It would behoove us to discuss it at length.
Right, like it's also the view of the society values for people.
Yeah, yeah. What Warren does is very, very unusual nowadays. Nowadays, we are all encouraged to make ourselves feel good, to take care of ourselves. You seek your own happiness. And it's very different from the Puritan ethic, which is put the community first, put your family first, put your vows first, put your marriage first. And that was very constrictive in many ways. And the code that we have now is very loose, and in some ways it's not as helpful to the community. So in Edith Wharton's book, The Age of Innocence, she writes about two people who fall in love, although one of them, the man, is already engaged to another woman. And that book is set up creating the tension based on this similar situation. He has made a vow to marry May, and her whole family circles around him and supports him and protects him. But he falls in love with Ellen Olenska, who is a member of May's family, but she's a distant cousin, and she's divorced. So she is kind of a scarlet woman. And so the tension in the book is concerned with whether or not he will be much, much happier with Ellen. We all feel that. She's much more interesting than May, who's very stolid and not intelligent. And she's not going to make him happy as a wife. But he's made this promise. And in the end, he keeps his promise to May and to the family. And what Wharton is doing there is saying, at that time in the 1880s in New York, society was focused on supporting the family unit, supporting the community, instead of having romantic love affairs and breaking things apart. It was constrictive, but it was also positive and constructive in terms of society itself. So what Warren is doing is he's doing both, actually. He's saying, I will not break up my family, but he also says, for my own sense of self, I can't go on doing this.
So Ellen Pickus wrote, Ethan Frome, suicide because he can't cruelly leave the wife.
Yeah, I mean, that's another one of her. Wharton writes about morality all the time, morality and society. And in House of Mirth, which was written much earlier in 1904, I think, that's one in which she kind of indicts society. And Lily Barth, who dies either by suicide or unintentionally, because she has a moral code, because she refuses to do the one thing that would save her life, which is to blackmail somebody with some letters. And she won't do that. And so she loses her life. So that's also about a moral code and the question of honor.
So on a lighter note, somebody, Robbie Stillman asked, why did you choose Warren's profession as an architect?
Well, that does have a relationship to my own private life. I have 3 brothers-in-law who are architects. So that is a profession that I know very well, and I am very fond of all 3 of them. And so it's something that again, writers draw on their own lives. I could do this without having to spend 5 years learning about a culture that I didn't know. I could write about somebody whose ideas and whose interests and whose work was very familiar to me.
My daughter's an architect too. I like that part.
Oh, good.
So Warren was a man of honor, yet he had other affairs. Did you consider Warren leaving his family, especially as his daughter will never allow him back, and yet damaged his breakup with Sarah?
So what is the question?
Warren leaving his family, especially as his daughter will never allow him back, and yet demanded his breakup with Sarah.
I'm not sure what the question is. I hear
Do you want to ask it if I'm not reading it correctly? I don't see her on.
It doesn't make sense.
All right, next question. Why was Kat so unforgiving?
Well, I think I've talked about that a bit. She really got stuck. And so she on the one hand, she's being drawn into another family, her own with her husband and child. And on another, she is passionately protective of her mother. And she also feels on a level that she may not even be aware of that she can never trust her father again. And she gets stuck. She gets caught in this pattern of distancing herself from him, and she can't get out of that.
Right.
She will.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
It's I'm the one with the quizzical question here.
Tell us.
We talk about Warren being a man of honor, yet you did mention in the book he had other affairs before Sarah.
Mhm.
So that's breaking the code of honor.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering, did you ever consider a different ending where, since his daughter is really so, she's never going to let him back in to the way it was ever, that given those circumstances that he would go with Sarah and leave his family, it's sort of like he's a man of honor, but he really isn't a man of honor to the degree that we've been discussing this afternoon, since he had other affairs outside the marriage.
So he had two very brief flings decades earlier, I think in the 70s or the 80s. And he broke both of them off with the understanding that it was not something he ever wanted to do again. So yes, he had two brief incursions, but he is not a serial adulterer. He had never had a long-term relationship and never wanted that. So a lot of people have said what you've said. So maybe he shouldn't have had any affairs at all. But he is somebody who, well, first of all, the 70s and 80s were a time when that was really common, really, really common. And secondly, he was somebody who felt the urge to step outside his marriage. Once he did it, he recognized that that was not the path for him. He was not going to go on doing that. He didn't want serial affairs. He didn't want a long-term relationship outside his marriage. And so he stopped. But he is not a long-term adulterer at all. That was just to show he had this other inclination, but he stopped.
Are there any other questions that anybody wants to ask? Well, thank you. This was more than interesting. Thank you very much. Do you have any comments you want to make that we didn't?
I don't know. It's very interesting to hear from readers. And as I say, some people have told me their own stories. One woman said, this is my story. My sister is 60. Our father is 82. She will not speak to his wife. And I say, give it up. He's 82. How long are you going to do this? And she says, if she's coming to the Cape this summer, I'm not going to be there. So, there are people who've said this is really part of a family dynamic, that people get stuck, they take a position, and it doesn't matter what the larger issue is. For them, it's that feeling within the family that's the most important. They take a position and they're never going to move it. And so for her, for that woman, she probably feels that it is a matter of honor for her. Another woman said that she had lost her mother when she was in her teens, and her father remarried a woman who was also a widow. And she said, and they were wonderful to us. They always made it clear that this wasn't their first choice. They would have stayed married to the people who they originally married. And they were very careful not to make us ever feel that our original families had been lost. And she said, but that was years ago, and my father has died now. And she said, I now realize they were really in love, and they felt they had to keep that from us in order to make us feel happy. She said, I wish I had asked him about that. I wish I had talked to him about that. So it's brought up all kinds of interesting responses from people who see connections between the book and their own lives. So that's been interesting for me.
Yeah, it definitely brought up a lot of questions in the book. I've recommended it to, I work at a library here, and I've recommended it to a lot of people who come in here. It's very good. So Robin Flick asked, do you think about Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina, this as a male narrator?
Oh, they don't have, I mean, Madame Bovary doesn't have a male narrator. It's an omniscient narrator, but it's written by a man about a woman. That's a really good question. In the 19th century, there were so many more male writers than women writers that we got used to hearing about women written by men because men wrote everything. Madame Bovary is a really interesting book to consider from that point of view. Gustave Flaubert claimed in his letters that he despised both his main characters, Charles and Emma Bovary. And to some extent he did, and he's very dismissive, particularly of Emma. Well, Charles he presents as kind of a dope, and Emma is unspeakably, narrative, not narrator. Yeah, they are both narratives written by men about women. Good, very good question. So Flaubert, instead of trying to actually be inside Emma, seems to be making fun of her often. And the way I talk about this to my students is, and Charles too, he makes fun of Charles. And he also famously says after the book comes out, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. I am Madame Bovary. So I think that if he really only despised her, we would not still be talking about the book 150 years later, because at some level he kind of loves Emma and feels sorry for her. And there are moments, to me, of great empathy for her. And those are the moments that connect us to that book. And all the moments in which he is disparaging and condescending, not only to Emma, but to everybody in the community. He's very condescending. So if it were only condescension, I don't think we'd still be reading it. I think the part of the book that connects us to it is the fact that on some level that he may not have understood, he feels great sympathy and a deep connection to this flawed, selfish, trivial, vain, dishonest woman who's part of the bourgeoisie. So that's Flaubert. For Tolstoy, that's one of the greatest books ever written, in my opinion. And it's a tour de force that he enters into Anna's mind as deeply as he does and as sympathetically. Anna's very different from Emma. She's a woman of great character and great depth, and for her, honor is very important. So when she first has an affair, she is devastated at her own loss of honor, compared to Emma, who looks at herself in the mirror and says, I have a lover. I have a lover. It's so cool. And Anna throws herself on the floor sobbing because she has destroyed her own code. And part of the way that Tolstoy reached the soul of Anna was through the letters of his sister, who had a very similar situation and who had been abandoned by the aristocratic lover that she had been living with and with whom she'd had a child. He was Swedish, and she lived with him in Morocco and didn't dare come back to Russia with this illegitimate child, and considers suicide. And Tolstoy was very close to his sister, and these letters were devastating to him and very, very compelling. So he enters into the life and mind of a woman who is drawn in two directions. She's passionately engaged by her lover, but also completely engaged by her child. And so one of the sources of tragedy in Anna Karenina is the fact that she can't get over the loss of her son, her beloved son. In the very opening scene, when she's on the train with Vronsky's mother, she says, I have never been separated. This is the first time I've ever been separated from my son overnight in his life. He's then 8 or 9. So for her, the loss of her son is as dramatic and devastating as the feared loss of Vronsky, which will certainly happen. So my sense about that book is that Tolstoy achieved this miraculous engagement with Anna that I find completely persuasive and convincing and sympathetic. It's a long answer.
Thank you. Anybody else? She wrote that, I mean that leaving is the story of a man who takes his life as the result of a love affair. Flaubert said the heroine must suffer, and leaving the hero suffers. I wonder whether this was your writing, the male ending in his life in the end.
Oh, interesting. You mean I was getting back at Flaubert? I was taking the opposite position. I wasn't thinking of that. I wasn't thinking of that. I wasn't thinking about Flaubert. I just,
Roxanne,
yeah.
oh, I wanted to thank you so much for this. I think Emma Bovary and Anna Karenina they're so much a part of you. Those narratives are so much a part of you, and to some extent even to The Lighthouse, not for the same reason, but that I couldn't help but wonder whether in writing this somehow that made its way, that story of someone dying as the result of a love affair, somehow the story of a man dying, like, why not? Why doesn't a man kill himself? So that's what I wondered.
It's a really good point. Yeah, in opera, I mean, I didn't know about Flaubert's comment, but certainly in opera, the narrative usually involves the death of the heroine, and partly because she's considered a vessel for emotion, and also because she's so beautiful, and women are more fragile than men. So, as a symbol on stage, the woman dying has been considered a very powerful presence. I wasn't thinking about that, but it's a good point. It's a really good point. Maybe I'm redressing the balance, getting back for decades and centuries of women having to bear the brunt of things and a man doing it. But it was really, I mean, probably if I were thinking of anyone, it would be the man in the House of Mirth. No, sorry, in Age of Innocence. Because he does suffer because of his belief in honor, in an honorable code. But I wasn't thinking in terms of getting back for the number of deaths. It's a good idea, though.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This was wonderful. Thank you. And I even though you won't tell us your next book, I hope it comes out soon.
Thank you. I hope I finish it soon. That would be good.
Well, thank you so much for doing this today.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And thanks for all those good questions.
Yes,
Thank you
thank you.
so much.
I'm going to end